Good day. Today is Sunday, 3rd August 2025, and before I get into the details of what I'm going to discuss in this program, which will be again mainly principally Ukraine related, I should say that I'll make a few comments about something I discussed in my program yesterday. Specifically, my comments about the extraordinary changes, at least to me extraordinary changes in American statistics about the condition of the US economy, have had the effect, if I can put it like this, of kicking over a hornet's nest. I've had a flood of comments from all sorts of people taking various different views. Some have basically endorsed my general position, which is that I found it very difficult to understand how statistics could change so completely, could be revised so completely in such a short time frames and in such a continuous manner. I have to say, though, I've also had a number of other comments from various people, two people in particular. One of them a mathematician, another person, somebody who's worked in the markets, both of them with a keen understanding of statistics and certainly far more versed and familiar with this kind of territory and with these issues than I am. And basically their overall comments were that yes, the United States government does provide an awful lot of statistics at various times, that statistics as a result, the sheer number of statistics the US provides is greater than that of other comparable governments, that statistics absolutely do have to be revised from time to time. Sometimes these revisions have to be significant and substantial, and that a failure to revise statistics properly would simply compound errors going forward. So I want to stress these people who said these things seem to me to be people of authority, and of course, as experts, I do defer to their judgment. Perhaps I should have made it clear in my program yesterday that if I did have doubts about the way in which American statistics are collated and are published, and if I did have some understanding of Donald Trump's exasperation with this, and especially his anger at the way in which his belief that the US economy has been booming and firing all cylinders over the last couple of months has, with a few strokes of the statistical pen, turned into statistical dust. Even if I can perhaps understand some elements of Trump's exasperation and frustration, I don't believe that simply sacking people, shooting the messenger as it has been described, is going to make the situation better. Quite the contrary, in fact. Now, if you want to read a good article discussing this whole topic, one which gives deference to both views, both sides of this debate, but which nonetheless, based on the experience, the very great and deep experience of the person writing it, sets out opinions, clear opinions, and authoritative views as well, then I would suggest that you again go to Naked Capitalism and read an article by the incomparable Eve Smith. How much longer can we trust our economic statistics? It actually dates from 23rd of July of this year, so it actually precedes this latest massive revision. But as I said, it does address this whole question, and it does so in a very well-informed and, in my opinion, very interesting, and I would say authoritative way. Now, a number of points about this article. Firstly, Eve Smith does seem to have some concerns about the way in which statistics are collated and used in the United States. She does say that in other places it's worse, and one has to rely on statistics because, of course, anecdotal information is very dangerous and very difficult to use and is best avoided. And she gives a very interesting account of how she went to Mexico to investigate once the affairs of a business on behalf of a person who was at that time her client. This is back a long time ago, I think in the 1980s, and how dismayed she was to discover that in those days the Mexican government basically got by without publishing many statistics at all. You can read her account of that. But perhaps something else that she discusses in this article, which is completely unrelated to this topic of statistics, is the current stock market boom. And here I have to say I found what she had to say especially unnerving. I was aware that the boom in the stock market, the US stock market, is very narrowly based, that it is concentrated in 7 big tech companies. But what I had not appreciated until I read this article by Eve Smith was the way in which it is in reality even more narrowly based than that. It seems dangerously dependent, or perhaps excessively dependent, on earnings growth by one particular company, which is of course Nvidia. And that earnings growth has been in decline. It's still very strong, but it's not as stratospherically strong as it was. And well, it does seem, especially to someone like me, who is not somebody who is heavily involved in markets, in fact isn't involved in markets basically at all, it does seem to me a very slender base upon which to construct an entire stock market boom. Anyway, to repeat again, it's by E. Smith, it's in Naked Capitalism, it's published on the 23rd of July 2025, and its title is How Much Longer Can We Trust Our Economic Statistics? Now, that is what I'm going to say about this whole topic. Go and read Eve Smith's article. Of course, you're all welcome to develop and come to your own views. And if you want to inform me about what those views are on this whole question of economic statistics, I will read your comments with interest. And it could very well be that it will affect my development of my own opinions about this, but I think this is all I'm going to say about this topic in this program today, because there is indeed a great deal to discuss. Now, today, as it happens, the Russians are saying that they are expecting Steve Witkoff in Moscow. Donald Trump has confirmed that he is sending Witkoff to Moscow again, and presumably he's on his flight to Moscow as we're speaking. The day when Trump's deadline expires, the 8th of August looms, and I suspect that Trump is becoming increasingly nervous about the situation in which he finds himself in. He gave his interview to Newsmax, the interview that I discussed yesterday, the one in which he spoke about Putin being a tough cookie, the one in which he spoke about how the Russians seem to be intent on taking over the whole of Ukraine, and the one in which he again seemed to cast doubt on the ability of sanctions to shape or change Russian behavior. About that, by the way, he is absolutely right. Anyway, I suspect he's sending Witkoff in a last-ditch effort to try to get either some concessions from the Russians or at least some message from the Russians which would enable him to row back on his sanctions threats, the various deadlines that he gave, which he poured out, well, he started to pour out last month, and which he's since shortened, and which I suspect he's becoming increasingly worried about. Now, I don't know what the Russians are going to tell Witkoff, which might help Trump. I can't really see at the moment that they're in much of a mood to say anything. I'm going to go back to Putin's comments, which he made yesterday, or the day before yesterday, at the Valam monastery, which he was visiting with President Lukashenko of Belarus, and together with the various other comments of Putin's, which I discussed in my program yesterday, I saw from the Kremlin readout that Putin also said this: not long ago, our adversaries were confidently speaking of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. Today, their rhetoric has shifted. Now, their singular and desperate goal is to halt our offensive at any cost, whether by offering incentives or issuing threats or supplying more equipment and personnel to the armed forces of Ukraine. Their goal is to stop the advance first and then address these issues of rebuilding their military, which is to say, rebuilding the Ukrainian military. To reiterate, we are seeking a lasting and sustainable peace built on fundamentally sound principles that would serve the interests of Russia and Ukraine and ensure the security of both countries. Perhaps those voices on the Ukrainian side who, albeit cautiously, are beginning to raise the idea of dialogue are right in suggesting that we must begin to consider the issue of European security in general. And that, of course, is a reference to NATO and to NATO expansion. So here we see further evidence from Putin's comments of 2 days ago that he is not in any mood to make concessions, and nor are the Russians. And I've already discussed how the Chinese don't seem to be interested in making concessions either. And yesterday I spoke about how a source from the Indian government was contacting TASS and saying that the Indian government has no intention of telling Indian refiners to stop buying Russian oil, that India has no intention of reducing or stopping its purchases of Indian oil, of Russian oil, And I did wonder yesterday whether this might be simply a comment from TASS, because TASS is, after all, the official Russian news agency, and how reliable comments from an Indian source published by a Russian news agency might be. But yesterday we got a whole further avalanche of comments of the same kind, also sourced from sources within the Indian government, appearing in the US media, including the New York Times and in Reuters. So I don't think that there is any doubt at all that the Indians are not going to stop buying Russian oil. They've made that absolutely clear. They've made that clear to the Americans, apparently over the course of the negotiations on a trade deal between India and the United States. They've made that clear in messages that they've been sending to Russia, some of which have been published by the Russian news agency TASS, and probably the same sources, obviously instructed to do so by the Modi government and perhaps by Prime Minister Modi himself, are now conveying the same message to the British and American medias. India will not bend. It will not change its policy. it will continue to buy Russian oil. Russian oil is too important for India, for maintaining India's economic stability at a time of growing inflation. And in addition, India is a country which, as a future great power, as a leader of the non-aligned movement, as a country which fought long and hard to obtain its independence from Britain, is not prepared to compromise on its sovereignty, on its right to engage in economic decision-making. So Donald Trump now knows that India, China, Russia are not going to bend, and no doubt that is why he's sending Witkoff to Moscow. But as I said, Putin has made it fairly clear that he is not at the moment in any sort of conciliatory mood. In fact, on the contrary, Putin appears to believe that sentiment within Ukraine itself, within the Ukrainian political class, is gradually shifting towards acknowledging the reality that fundamental concessions to the Russians are the only way that Ukraine can preserve itself, continuing to trust the West, to accept offers of assistance from the West, continuing to hope that the West can somehow rescue Ukraine from its plight, are wrong and dangerous. One can almost sense that some Ukrainians, some high-level important Ukrainians, are beginning to understand that Ukraine has indeed been led by the West along the primrose path towards its destruction, and that if it continues to follow that path, destroyed it will be. Now, what is most interesting is that a day or so, a particular individual who has in the past been a known ultra hardliner has in effect admitted as much. This is none other than Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence. Now, some months ago, Budanov gave advice to members of the Ukrainian parliament that Ukraine had until the summer, now in other words, in order to turn the situation round, and if it failed to do so, if some sort of negotiated settlement wasn't achieved by this point, then the point of no return would have been reached. And someone, and I have no doubt it was Budanov himself, then leaked that same information to the media, and this appears to have provoked a major confrontation between Budanov and Zelensky and Yermak, and Yermak has made multiple attempts since then to have Budanov sacked, and Budanov is only clinging on to his job because up to now the Americans have been backing him. Well, a day or so ago, Budanov gave a further interview in which he went further still. Now, he discussed the general situation in the conflict. It was a long interview, and parts of it were very garbled, and the part I'm going to talk about was the answer he gave was garbled and long-winded as well. He spoke about how he's one of those people who collects stamps. He's a philatelist. He has often collected stamps, or so he says, of countries that which no longer exist. He didn't name which countries. But anyway, he's in the business of doing that. And he said that unless Ukraine is clear about what its priorities should be, about what it needs to do, then it might become another one of those countries whose stamps circulate, but the implication was which don't exist anymore. He didn't quite say that the survival of Ukraine as a state is now in balance, but that did seem very much to be the general tenor of his comments. Now, I'm going to say here what I personally believe. I think Budanov was an extreme hardliner at the start of the war in 2022 and 2023. I believe that for a very long time he was one of these people who insisted that there should be no compromise with the Russians. I think that what has gradually caused him to change his views is firstly the defeat of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, and secondly probably the difficulty of working with Zelensky, and anyway, the progress of events since then. I think that at some point after the fall of Avdiivka, he came to realize, perhaps sooner than other people within the Ukrainian leadership, that Ukraine was losing the war. As I have discussed in several programs now, we learnt some months ago, in fact it was a while back, in an article, I believe it was in the Washington Post, that in the spring of 2024, a meeting took place in Washington, which was attended by Ukrainian intelligence, in which the Ukrainians informed the Americans that there could be no victory if the war continued to be fought in a conventional way. That the only way the situation could be rescued is if there was a turn towards asymmetric action. Now, I don't know for a fact that Budanov was present at this meeting, but I suspect he was, and I suspect that this was an early indicator of his own doubts. Anyway, Ukraine has since attempted asymmetric war. One was the Kursk operation of August 2024. I have discussed my own beliefs about that operation. I've discussed how I've been informed by an extremely well-informed source that it was a trap laid for the Ukrainians by the Russians. Well, as I said, that's what that source has told me, and there's reasons to think he is right, and I discussed that again at some length in my program yesterday when I spoke about the consistent reliability of that source in providing me with information. Anyway, let me further say that I also have the continuing view, that the purpose of the Kursk operation in August 2023 was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. And when Budanov was talking about asymmetric moves by Ukraine to regain the initiative in the war, it was doing things like that. I've always believed that was the Ukrainian objective in Kursk. There is now significant body of information and evidence that tends to corroborate that view. It is certainly what the Russians themselves believe, or at least say, and again it's consistent with the report that the Ukrainians gave the Americans in the spring of 2024, that the only way that Ukraine could win or could avoid defeat would be through resort to asymmetric warfare. Anyway, what has happened since is that these attempts at asymmetric warfare have indeed been made. There was the Kursk operation, there were various actions taken on Russian territory, there was the missile strikes on Russia using the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, there were, well, probably things that we don't know about the attack, but also other things like the attacks on the Russian air bases, all of these various things. And of course, there's been the Ukrainian drone offensive against Russian energy facilities and other facilities. And of course, it's now become absolutely clear that none of that has worked. It has not changed the dynamic of the conflict. In fact, last night, even as the Russians continued to conduct their own massive combined drone and missile strikes on Ukraine, and even as the Russians are telling us that they are preparing to launch hundreds of jet-powered Duran drones against Ukraine, flying at altitudes beyond the reach of Ukraine's anti-drone air defenses, but still far less expensive than the air defense missiles that Ukraine would need to launch against these jet-powered drones in order to bring them down. Anyway, even as all of this plays out, Ukraine last night also launched its own drone attack on Russia, and it did have some drones did get through. There was damage done to a refinery in the resort city of Sochi, for example. But Budanov will have noticed that these are pinpricks, that none of this changes the dynamic of the situation on the ground. And we see that Budanov is becoming, with each interview he gives, with each report he makes, more pessimistic about the direction of the war. He is in effect saying, and this is the only way I can interpret his latest comments, he is in effect saying that the moment has now been reached where Ukraine must sit down, must start negotiating with the Russians in earnest, talking about Russia's memorandum and its terms, because the alternative is not just defeat, but defeat that will bring about the end of Ukraine. So that's what I think. Putin is picking up on all of this. He's picking up on some of the comments that the Ukrainian negotiators, or at least one of them, made at the last meeting in Istanbul, that there needs to be a general renegotiation of the entire security framework in Europe, which will have implications concerning NATO, that these, as I said, discussions are taking place, and Putin is picking up on all of these things. Now, I would add that some weeks ago, I received information from a source, and, well, it's a source I have alluded to in the past, but I'm not going to say more, which also has led me to think that there is indeed a sea change in Kiev, at least on the part of some people, about the war. But I don't feel that I can discuss this further now. I just want to put out that marker there, because I'm confident that in a few weeks' time we will probably be getting more information, and then I can return to this topic later. But anyway, there we go. That's Putin. So Putin has every reason to think that things are going his way. They're going his way militarily, as we shall see. They're going his way geopolitically and strategically. China will continue to buy Russian oil. India will continue to buy Russian oil. Turkey will continue to buy Russian oil and gas. The Russian economy has had a soft period because of the need to bring down inflation, but inflation is now indeed falling rapidly in Russia. We've had more statistics about this over the last couple of days, by the way, and interest rates therefore are starting to fall. It looks like this year's harvest in Russia will be bigger than last year's, and yes, industrial production output slowed, but it is likely to start cranking up further again later this year, going on into next year. So overall, Putin is in a confident mood, and he doesn't need to negotiate, or at least to make concessions, big concessions to Steve Witkoff or to the Americans. In fact, on the assumption that he does meet Witkoff, which I presume he will, I would not be surprised if Putin's advice to Witkoff, and by extension to Trump, is, look, we in Russia are not going to make any concessions. Don't look to us to make concessions. We're not afraid of what you are threatening us with, nor are we going to be bribed into calling off our special military operation now that it is working towards or approaching success. And I would just to talk about that, they're trying to persuade Russia, this was Putin's words, to stop their offensive by offering incentives, bribes if you prefer, or issuing threats, or supplying more equipment and personnel to the armed forces of Ukraine. None of that, not the bribes, nor the threats, nor the supplies of more weapons or personnel. It's an interesting comment. None of that is going to affect Moscow policy, the policies made in Moscow in any way whatsoever. And I think these comments of Putin's were made by before we had the announcement from Trump about how he was adjusting in some way the positioning of two of the US's nuclear submarines. Well, the Russians have been saying today that they have plenty of nuclear submarines of their own, and they're all on station, and they know roughly where the American nuclear submarines are, which I believe to be true, by the way. Just as I believe, by the way, that the Americans mostly know, at least the general position of where Russian nuclear submarines are. Perhaps it goes even further than that. Perhaps both sides, or one side or the other, knows exactly where the other side's nuclear submarines are. If so, it wouldn't surprise me at all, by the way. But I'm not going to explore a topic about which I am profoundly ignorant. Anyway, suffice to say, the Russians have made it clear that they don't take this positioning or adjustment by Donald Trump of his submarines at all seriously, and they're not going to be impressed by it. And if Trump did it in order to scare the Russians into making concessions when Witkoff comes, well, obviously that isn't going to work. So Witkoff may find that Putin will simply tell him, look, we're not going to be bribed, we're not going to be bullied or threatened or scared into making concessions to you. In fact, there is no need for us to make concessions, and there is no need for you either to demand them, because as a result of our continued advance, the political situation in Kiev is gradually starting to shift. Look at what one of the Ukrainian negotiators told us in Istanbul. Look at what Budanov is saying. Quite possibly, at some point over the next couple of months, there will be a fundamental change in Kiev, and then we might have a serious negotiation, and we might then achieve peace. You don't need to push to force the pace of events by making meaningless and pointless threats against us, which can only backfire. All you need to do is to do what we are doing, hold your nerve, wait, and it will all work out for the best. Of course, if Putin were to say that to Witkoff, and I'm just guessing that he might say something like that. I'm not saying he will, by the way. He would be talking a little bit with a forked tongue, because, of course, whilst that might be a very good outcome for the Russians, some people in the United States would not be happy with it at all. On that topic, I saw that there was a recent article, and I think it was the Washington Post, which spoke about how Republican warhawks, Mitch McConnell in other words, and his band in the Senate are now becoming increasingly emboldened, and that they are now looking for ways to start channeling funding to Ukraine again, in other words, funding for weapons, and how Trump's decision, his very bad decision of about a month ago, to not exactly reverse, but play down and water down the Pentagon's decision to stop weapons supplies to Ukraine, how that has emboldened these Republican warhawks, and how they're now looking for ways to take advantage of that to push Trump and the United States into providing more military assistance again for Ukraine. So those people obviously would not be happy, to put it mildly, if the outcome were anything like the one that I've suggested that Putin might suggest to Witkoff. But anyway, I'm not going to speculate further about what Putin will say to Witkoff. We'll just have to wait and see. It's just that at the moment, based on everything that we're hearing from Moscow and everything that Putin has himself said, it doesn't seem as if the Russians are in any mood to compromise at all. They feel under no pressure to do so. As far as they're concerned, they're winning the war, and that is all there is to it. Now, I did want to, however, return to this Washington Post article about the Republican warhawks, fine momentum, a trust but very fine moment with Trump and all that. That was the title of the article. And here again I come back to the point that I made when the initial stop on military assistance to Ukraine was ordered by the Pentagon, the one that Trump partially walked back. Because Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, all of these people in the Senate, they can put as much pressure on Donald Trump as they wish. They can make Donald Trump's life as difficult as they want. But one of the things they cannot do is conjure up weapons for Ukraine which do not exist. If there is a genuine shortage of Patriot air defense missiles, which there is, and if there is a general shortage of air defense missiles across the West, which there also is, then McConnell and Lindsey Graham and the others, Tom Cotton and all the rest, they can't spin weapons like that out of thin air. They're not magicians in that way. They're not dealers in those sort of miracles, if one wants to describe that even as a miracle. Their actions over the last month show again an incredible inability to accept the realities imposed by the limits of American power. The problem with these people ultimately is that they will never accept that there are limits to American power. And in my opinion, this has been America's problem, not just over the course of this conflict in Ukraine, but in terms of its overall foreign, defense, and security policies for at least the last 30 years and arguably for much longer. Simply willing an outcome, victory in Ukraine, defeat for Russia, the overthrow of that terrible man, Vladimir Putin, simply willing it is never going to be enough if the means to do it are not there. And of course, those means are not there. Now, in saying this, of course, I would always add, as this Washington Post article effectively acknowledges, that this battle about arming Ukraine is only partially about Russia and Ukraine. It is also a battle for control of the Republican Party. The McConnell wing of the Republican Party feels itself under growing pressure from the MAGA movement, from people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others in Congress, people like Josh Hawley and others also in the Senate. And of course they're pushing back. But they are pushing back from a completely false position, because that entire argument depends on unlimited US power and is therefore an unrealistic one, whereas the argument of their Republican critics, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, Josh Hawley, Steve Bannon, and all of those, the people at the Federalist, ultimately is based on a recognition of the clearly established and ultimately unarguable facts. As some wise person once said, facts are stubborn things. You might not want to acknowledge them, but you can't simply wish them away, which is what McConnell and co. seem to want to do. Trump, I suspect, at some deep level, has some understanding of this, but he remains extremely nervous of the McConnell wing. He's very intimidated by them. Probably not so much by McConnell himself, but clearly by Lindsey Graham, who he has given an unhealthy, even dangerous amount of deference to. And, well, he's most unwisely gone along with them, especially on the topic of Ukraine, in ways that have put him in the very difficult and forced position in which he now finds himself, and which I think he's trying to get out of by sending Witkoff to Moscow. His big mistake, his biggest mistake over the last few weeks, if I'm going to say, was his decision to water down the decision taken by Hegseth and Feinberg and Colby to stop the further weapons deliveries to Ukraine. He pretended that this was done without his knowledge. He was unnerved by some of the negative criticism. He watered down that decision. He spoke to Merz and Zelensky. He entered into this extremely unhealthy and frankly unsustainable arrangement of selling weapons to NATO, paid for by European taxpayers, which will be forwarded to Ukraine, something which, by the way, has up to now not happened. There is some talk that from now on the Ukrainians will be getting weapons in tranches of about $500 million, depending on how many European countries and at what time decide to stomp up sums like that. Very unsatisfactory altogether. I think it was a massive mistake of Donald Trump's doing that. It may have seemed like a clever way of avoiding criticism in Washington, but the reality is that as the situation deteriorates in Ukraine, as the Europeans fail to come up with the money, judging from that article by the Washington Post, McConnell, Graham, and the others are going to renew their demands that the United States supply weapons directly to Ukraine, and does so as it has done previously, directly and for free, cutting NATO and the Europeans out. Whether Trump will do that, of course, I very much doubt. He really would become Joe Biden in that case. He would absolutely enrage his MAGA base. Marjorie Taylor Greene is already writing long pieces on X, complaining fiercely about these policies, this continued support for Ukraine. Anyway, this is the forced position that Trump has placed himself in and the United States in, because he listens to the Republican hardliners and won't address the underlying realities that even a country as powerful and as rich as the United States has limits on what it can realistically do. Anyway, this is where we are at the moment in the conflict, or rather in the negotiations, if I can call them that, between the Russians and the Americans and the Ukrainian ones and the Ukrainians. To repeat again what I said yesterday, I myself don't believe that the Russians seriously expect any kind of diplomatic breakthrough with the Americans. I don't think the Russians really believe that there's going to be any sudden breakthrough with the Ukrainians either, at least in terms of the diplomacy at the moment. Their priority is to continue the war, but I think that they are starting to sense that in Kiev at least, the ground is beginning to shift and become more favourable to finally to serious negotiations with them. Anyway, that now brings me to the military situation, which I've only touched on very lightly in my most recent programmes. There has been more news over the last 2 days, and it is important. Now, yesterday, the Russians, at least not the Russian Ministry of Defense, but various Russian Telegram channels and bloggers claimed that a village called Sukhetsk, which is located to the northeast of Rodinsk, between Rodinsk and Belitska, that this village, Belitska, this village has now fallen. And that means that with Sukhetsk captured by the Russians, the road leading into Pokrovsk from the north has indeed been conclusively cut. There are no Russian troops basically parked on that road. And Rodinsk itself has been basically encircled. I said some days ago that there was a report that the Ukrainians had abandoned Rodinsk. I said that I didn't believe those claims. It looks as if those claims were indeed untrue. But the point is that the Russians have now in effect all but encircled Rodinsk. There are reports that the Russians have captured the Krasny Liman mine immediately to the east of Rodinsk. Again, no confirmation of this, but this is what some of the reports are saying. If so, Rodinska is indeed likely to fall within the next couple of days, perhaps even hours, and Bilitska probably soon after as well. I believe that the Russians have been west of this road for several days. As I pointed out some time ago, the Daily Telegraph basically corroborated claims by Redovka, the Russian newspaper, that the Russians are within 10 kilometers of Dobropilia. And for that to be true, it seems to me that the Russians must be, at some point, to the west of this road. Just saying. So that means that the road to Pokrovsk, the supply road to Pokrovsk, from the north is now in effect cut. Now, there's been more pictures appearing of Russian troops inside Pokrovsk itself. It's all very confusing, and it's difficult to get an overall sense of exactly what is happening, and it's been suggested that there are no proper front lines inside Pokrovsk, that the Ukrainian defenses are basically scattered in various fortified positions, that the Ukrainian defenders have no ability or have lost the ability to coordinate with each other, and that it's very, very difficult to get a sense of exactly what's going on in Pokrovsk overall. Just saying. The latest pictures appear to show Russian troops moving in the southeast of Pokrovsk, apparently without feeling themselves in any obvious danger. So it looks as if large areas of Pokrovsk, both in the southeast and in the southwest, are indeed under Russian control. One continues to read about sabotage and reconnaissance troops of the Russian army having entered Pokrovsk. I don't believe that anymore. I am sure that these are organized units of the Russian army that are operating inside Pokrovsk. I believe that one of the positions that the Ukrainians continue to control is a micro-district called Shakhtarska, which is in the south of Pokrovsk, though it looks as if the Russians control the neighboring position of Troyande, maybe a village or a micro-district, I am not sure. But anyway, the Ukrainians seem to control Shakhtarska, and they probably control positions in northeastern Pokrovsk as well. There are very conflicting stories about whether or not the Russians have blocked the E50 road leading to Pokrovsk from the west. On my map, the Google map that I'm actually looking at the moment, it continues to refer to this road, the E50 road, when it enters Pokrovsk, as being temporarily closed, which strongly suggests that the Russians have indeed cut it. If they haven't done so yet, in the sense that they haven't yet actually gained physical control over it, I suspect that it's now so close to Russian positions, so exposed to ambushes by Russian units and of course Russian drones, that it is in effect unusable. I don't know how big the garrison in Pokrovsk, the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk, actually is, but its condition must indeed be now one of crisis. I noticed that Julian Röpke, the German journalist who writes for Bild Zeitung and who is an ardent supporter of Ukraine, is also now acknowledging a catastrophic situation for the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk, and he appears to believe that that Pokrovsk is indeed about to fall. And I see no reason to doubt this. I suspect that effectively the Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk have either already collapsed or have become fragmented to the point of unsustainability. And it seems to me that we're looking on a rather larger canvas. Pokrovsk is a much bigger place, and with more Ukrainian troops, there are at least parts of several Ukrainian brigades stationed in Pokrovsk. Anyway, it looks to me that we are in a situation not that different from what we saw during the collapses in Avdiivka and Ugledar, when the Ukrainians were still clinging on to some positions inside both of those towns, but were in effect surrounded, and when their defences, their ability to defend themselves was disintegrating. So that's the situation as far as I can work it out in Pokrovsk. If I am right, then a collapse in Pokrovsk could come at any moment. It might happen within the next 24 hours. I think it is more likely to take still a couple of days. I am going to guess that for it to happen, the Russians would first need to capture Rodinsk. I think Rodinsk's fall will probably be the moment when whatever Ukrainian troops are still fighting in Pokrovsk will realize that they're fighting in vain, and that the only thing left for them to do is to take action as quickly as they can to save their lives. So Rodinsk's fall might be decisive in that regard. But anyway, I don't think that's happened yet. It could happen, as I said, within the next 24 hours. If it does, then I suspect that we will see a rapid collapse in Pokrovsk, in Mirnograd. The entire area, the entire defense in Pokrovsk could implode with the same suddenness that it did in Avdiivka and Ugledar. So that's my summary of the situation in Pokrovsk. Now, there are things going on in other places on the battle lines. Now, again, it's perhaps not entirely easy to say whether this is really the case, but there were reports yesterday that the long battle of Volchansk is now over, that a group of forces north has now broken through Ukrainian defenses south of the Volcha River. In another area, that the industrial area of Volchansk has fallen, and that the entirety of Volchansk south of the Volcha River has also fallen to the Russians. I've heard that report. I'm not sure. I've read the reports from group of forces north. I'm not sure that that is exactly what they say. Maybe we should wait for the Russian Ministry of Defense to report more clearly what the situation in Volchansk is. Of course, if Volchansk has fallen, then it's the third big town to fall in Ukraine this year. The first was Toretsk, the second was Chasiv Yar, the third will be Volchansk. But as I said, as of yet, we haven't had clear confirmation of this. In the meantime, there has been more fighting taking place in Konstantinovka. There are now reports that another important position close to Konstantinovka has now fallen. This is the village of Alexandro Kalinova. Again, it looks to me as if the Ukrainian defenses south of Konstantinovka are collapsing, and perhaps once Pokrovsk does indeed fall, we will start to see things happen in that area too, rather rapidly. With Alexandro Kalinova having indeed fallen, and now there are pictures of Russian troops all over the village. This having happened soon after the fall of the neighbouring village of Yablunovka, which, as far as I know, by the way, the Russian Defence Ministry has not yet confirmed the full capture of. But anyway, with that news, it seems to me that the Ukrainian defenders in Klimanbek and Katerinovka, south of the Klimanbek reservoir, are indeed effectively trapped. Anyway, the other, perhaps even more interesting news is in the Liman Siversk area. Now, about 3 days ago, based on what the Ukrainians were saying, I said that a Russian advance towards Siversk launched, it seems, from the village of Verkhokamyanska, which is located immediately to the east of Siversk, appeared to have failed. It looked as if that attack had been repelled by the Ukrainians. That was what the Ukrainians themselves were claiming. Now, the latest reports suggest that that might have been untrue, that in fact the Russians have either reached the very boundary of Siversk from the east, or that they might even have entered Siversk from the east. And some of the maps are now showing a whole belt of territory, not very big belt of territory, because Verkhokamyanska and Siversk are already quite close to each other, but a belt of territory between Verkhokamyanska and Siversk under Russian control. So it seems that the Russians have been making more progress there, and apparently there's imagery and video footage of this, though I haven't seen it. But perhaps more alarming for the Ukrainians is that the Russians have now published footage of Russian troops in southern Torske. This is this village located to the west of Siversk. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that this village had been captured by the Russians some weeks ago. Then there were all kinds of claims that the Ukrainians had recaptured this particular village. Perhaps true. But the point is, the fighting appears to have resumed for this village, and it looks as if the Russians are indeed now very much in the process of overrunning it, or at least of gaining control over it, in which case the Russians are located immediately to the northwest of Siversk, well positioned to cut the supply roads to Siversk from the west. Siversk is looking increasingly as if it has been taken into a semicircle, that it is very close to finding itself in a cauldron, with the Russians controlling Verkhokamyanska to the east, Belogorovka, Grigorovka, and Serebyanka to the north, and Torske a little bit to the northwest as well. And of course, the supply roads to Siversk from the south have long since been cut as a result of Russian control of Bakhmut and Solidar. So if this is correct, then probably, if Torske is indeed captured, the Russians will mount another attack on Siversk. The Ukrainians in Siversk might soon be short of supplies and reinforcements as well. It may be that they will have to make the decision to retreat. And retreating in this area again is going to be very difficult because Siversk is in effect in a kind of salient. It's surrounded on at least three sides by the Russians. The escape routes are going to look increasingly fragile if Torske falls. Part of them, by the way, would pass immediately south of what is referred to on Google Maps as an ostrich farm. I can't imagine what that is and whether there's any actual ostriches there anymore. But anyway, I suspect this long battle is also now approaching its end. Now, the fall of Torske also, of course, has an impact on the battle for Liman. The Russians recently were reported as storming a village called ODYSEE to the northeast of Liman. And if they capture Torske and another village called Zarichne, then they're very close to Liman as well. And if the Ukrainian defenses in Siversk collapse, then to say bluntly, I think that Liman is undefendable. And Liman will quickly fall, and that would put the Russians again within striking distance of Slavyansk as well. And of course, the Russians controlled Liman for a time in the summer of 2022. They never, however, captured the village to the southeast of Liman called Rygorodok. If the Russians were to capture that village, Rygorodok, then they would be on the outskirts of Slavyansk. Anyway, we'll see. So a lot going on the battlefields. The main battle continues to be Pokrovsk, but we can see that all of the Ukrainian lines here are cracking. There's also, incidentally, been some rather anguished comments by the Ukrainians, by Ukrainian bloggers and commentators about the situation in Kherson region. That the Russians have cleared further islands in the Dnieper estuary near Kherson, the city of Kherson, that the Russians have just bombed and perhaps destroyed a bridge that links two parts of the city of Kherson. I'm not exactly certain about where this bridge is located, but there certainly are pictures of this bridge being destroyed. Apparently, the area that's referred to is called Korabyol, which is the southern tip of Kherson, and in theory, it's basically an island. You can see that it's bisected by either a canal or a river which connects to the Dnieper itself. It may be that the Russians are about to advance into this area of southern Kherson city. I'm not going to make any predictions or guesses. I'm hardly in a position to. All I will say is that it does look as if the situation is deteriorating in Kherson. I read a very anguished discussion about the situation there from a Ukrainian, I think it's civilian, who is saying that it is no longer possible to drive securely in most of the areas on the Ukrainian side of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, because the Russian drones are everywhere and the towns and villages are becoming deserted because communication is becoming impossible, and the Russians are sensed to be too close, and that the only thing that is basically holding the Russians back from launching an offensive in this area is not so much the Ukrainian defenders, who are few, relatively few, but the Dnieper itself. The Dnieper continues to be the barrier that continues to hold the Russians back. Anyway, that's what some of these reports are saying. So one could see the deteriorating picture across the entire battlefields. Now, a Ukrainian volunteer, I think her name is Berlinka, Maria Berlinka, I might be completely wrong, Berlinska, has actually come up with some casualty figures for the Ukrainian army. She says that on a typical day now, they lose around 300 people killed. 300 people killed on a typical day and 750 wounded. And that the overall losses, if one adds to those who desert, that the overall losses in any particular month is around 46,500. And according to Maria Berlinska, if this continues for very much longer, then by the end of the year, the entire Ukrainian army will have melted away. Now, I suspect that she is exaggerating. She's basically saying that the losses are so far in excess of reinforcements, the mobilization having essentially failed, or at least failing to produce enough men to replace those who are lost. She's saying that by the end of the year, the Ukrainian army will have basically eroded to the point, or shrunk to the point, where it is no longer able to hold the front line and where resistance will start to break down. Now, this brings me back to something I said in my program yesterday, which is that actually I misquoted Donald Trump. I've often said that sometimes I have difficulty seeing things. I only glanced at his Truth Social post about Russian losses and Ukrainian losses. I believed him to say that the Russians had lost 20,000 men killed since the start of the year, against 8,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed since the start of the year. In fact, what Trump said was that 112,000 Russian soldiers have died since the beginning of the year, 20,000 being killed in the past month, as opposed to just 8,000 Ukrainian troops who have been killed since the start of the year. Now, that I can absolutely, definitely say is fantasy. And I wonder whether this is indeed intelligence that has been provided to Trump, or whether this isn't just more numbers that he's plucking off the top of his head. Just saying, with Trump, the possibility that it is the second always exists. But for the record, if it is indeed the case that Trump has actually been provided by these with these numbers, presumably by the CIA, who in fact definitely are getting them from the Ukrainians, then, as a number of people are pointing out, that may explain why he is so baffled and so frustrated and so angry about the fact that Putin and the Russians are refusing to make the fundamental concessions to end the war that he expects. He simply cannot understand why the Russians refuse to negotiate when they are, refuse to capitulate, rather, when they are bearing this level of losses. As I said, the reality is that these numbers make no sense. They are, frankly, practically absurd. Even if the Russian losses were true, and they would be greater than the number of losses, Russian deaths, that Mediazona has so far identified, or almost the same number as the total number of Russian deaths that Mediazona has identified for the entire war, I absolutely do not believe that Ukrainian losses are less than a tenth of what Russian losses are. All of the evidence overwhelmingly points in the other direction. And as I said in my program yesterday, Trump perhaps needs to remember that when he last had a discussion with Putin, and Putin provided him with information about Russiagate, which was in contradiction to the information that was being provided to Trump by US intelligence, it was Putin who, it now seems, was telling the truth, not US intelligence. And perhaps Trump needs to remember that. Just saying. Anyway, put all that aside, I prefer Belinska's claims. She is, after all, within the Ukrainian army, to these numbers that Trump is coming up with. I'm not entirely convinced, by the way, that he hasn't made up these numbers, as he makes up all sorts of numbers at various times. I'm not sure that he has indeed been given an actual intelligence briefing that provides him numbers like this. Or perhaps he has, and it could be that this is what Zelensky is telling him, and maybe Lindsey Graham is supporting these claims, and that this explains why Trump is making these mistakes, in which case, obviously, it's even more alarming, because by this point in the war, Trump should know that it's a big mistake to believe any figures that come from Zelensky at all. But anyway, I think Belinska is overstating things. I don't believe that we are anywhere as close to a Ukrainian collapse as she is saying. But do bear in mind, she is a Ukrainian in the Ukrainian military. She's a volunteer, as I understand it. She is providing information, in other words, from a Ukrainian perspective. This cannot be written off as Russian propaganda, as far too many people are inclined to do, and it provides a sense of the general mood at this time in Ukraine. Anyway, there it is. That's the overall military situation, as far as I can see it, in Ukraine at the present time. Well, as I said, Witkoff is either heading to Moscow or is already in Moscow. We will see whether he meets Putin. We will see what comes out of the meeting. We will see what Trump decides to do. If, by the way, he puts off imposing sanctions on the 8th of August, he will bring down upon his head the wrath of Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, and the rest. they won't forgive him for doing that. Whatever excuse he comes up with, they now have the bit between their teeth and they won't let go. If he does impose the sanctions, if he does follow up with the tariffs that he is threatening, he will be propelled back into an economic war with all of the results that we all know. And then, again, as night follows day, all of these people will once again blame him. I don't see that whatever happens now, the outcome for Donald Trump is going to be good at all. But he is the Houdini of American politics. He's got himself into seemingly impossible situations in the past, and he's managed to wriggle out of them. I'm not saying that he won't be able to do it again, though I suspect that it's from this point onwards, it's going to go on getting harder and harder and harder. He has, I suspect, burnt up a lot of his goodwill already with his MAGA base. And to be frank, I don't think he looks quite as dominant as he did, say, 3 months ago. So anyway, we shall see what happens. Now, I'm going to finish by quoting someone I very rarely do quote as it happens, who is Senator Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders is talking about Donald Trump's strange misuse of tariffs as a kind of geopolitical tool, a kind of sanctions. And I was interested to see that Senator Bernie Sanders is now saying exactly the same thing. Tariffs must be seriously thought out and used to help American workers and consumers. They should not be used to punish the political decisions of our allies. Canada has a right to set its own policy on Palestine. Americans shouldn't pay the price because Donald Trump doesn't like it. In other words, don't confuse tariffs with sanctions. Tariffs are an economic and taxation tool. They should not be misused as a political or geopolitical tool. That is what sanctions are. Well, that's what Senator Bernie Sanders is saying. And you could say that Senator Bernie Sanders is right and that I agree with him. Except I'm not going to say that exactly, because we on the Duran, to be precise, Alex Christoforou, who I think was the first to say it, and then I myself have been saying this now for several weeks, well before Senator Bernie Sanders got round to saying it. Would it not be more true to say, therefore, that it is he who is now agreeing with us? Anyway, on that thought, I'm going to end my program today. More from me soon. We'll no doubt find out soon enough what Steve Witkoff has achieved, if anything, in Moscow. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.